You have lived your entire life inside an idea. It shapes the air you breathe, the work you do, the choices you believe are available to you. It determines why your healthcare costs what it does, why your job feels precarious, why your city looks the way it looks. It is so pervasive that most people do not even have a name for it. They simply call it the way things are. The idea is neoliberalism. And whether you have heard the term or not, it has structured your world more profoundly than any religion, any political party, any single leader or movement of the past 50 years. This is not a conspiracy. There are no shadowy figures pulling strings from hidden rooms. Neoliberalism spread the way most powerful ideas spread, through think tanks and university departments, through politicians who believed they were solving real problems, through ordinary people who accepted its premises because the alternatives seemed to have failed. It became common sense. It became invisible. And in becoming invisible, it became almost impossible to question. Tonight, we trace how this happened. We go back to the origins, to a small group of intellectuals meeting in the Swiss Alps in 1947, alarmed by what they saw as the march of collectivism, determined to revive a philosophy they believed could save civilization. We follow their ideas as they moved from academic obscurity to the corridors of power, transforming first Chile, then Britain and America, then the entire globe. This is not a story with simple heroes or villains. The people who built neoliberalism believed they were fighting tyranny. The policies they implemented sometimes worked and sometimes devastated. The world they created is the one we inherited, more prosperous in some ways, more unequal in almost all ways, more anxious and atomized and uncertain than the world that came before. Before we begin this journey through the idea that remade everything, a gentle note. If these evening explorations of history help you unwind, please consider taking a moment to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover these stories. And we're always interested in your reflections. Let us know in the comments how neoliberalism has shaped your own life, or which historical turning points you'd like us to explore next. Now, as the noise of the day fades and the quieter hours arrive, let us travel back to 1947, to a hotel on a Swiss mountainside, where a group of worried intellectuals gathered to save the world from what they believed was a terrible mistake. This is the bedtime history of how neoliberalism changed everything. The hotel perched high above Lake Geneva, surrounded by alpine meadows just beginning to bloom with spring flowers. It was April 1947. The war had ended less than 2 years before. Europe lay in ruins, and 39 intellectuals from 10 countries had gathered at the Hôtel du Parc in the village of Montpellier to discuss what had gone wrong with civilization and how to fix it. The man who had organized this meeting was Friedrich Hayek, an Austrian economist teaching at the London School of Economics. Hayek was 57 years old, deeply pessimistic about the direction of Western society, and convinced that everything he valued was under threat. The threat, as he saw it, was not fascism. That had just been defeated. The threat was something that most of his contemporaries considered progressive and humane, the growing role of government in economic life. Hayek looked at the post-war world and saw collectivism triumphant. In Britain, the Labour Party had swept to power promising a welfare state and nationalized industries. In America, the New Deal had transformed the relationship between citizens and government. Across Western Europe, social democratic parties were building what would become the most generous safety nets in human history. And in the East, of course, the Soviet Union represented collectivism in its most extreme form. To most observers, this seemed like progress. The unregulated capitalism of the 19th century had produced extraordinary wealth, but also extraordinary misery. Child labor, urban squalor, boom and bust cycles that threw millions into poverty. The Great Depression had discredited laissez-faire economics so thoroughly that even conservatives accepted the need for government intervention. The war had demonstrated that states could mobilize resources effectively for common purposes. Why not use that capacity to ensure that everyone had healthcare, education, housing, security? Hayek saw it differently. He believed that the road to the welfare state was the road to serfdom, the title of his 1944 book that had made him famous. Central planning, however well-intentioned, would inevitably lead to tyranny. The state that controlled the economy would eventually control everything else. The difference between democratic socialism and Soviet communism was one of degree, not kind. Both led to the same destination, a society where individuals were subordinated to collective purposes, where freedom was sacrificed to equality, where the spontaneous order of the market gave way to the arbitrary decisions of bureaucrats. The intellectuals who gathered at Mont Pelerin shared this diagnosis, though they differed on details. There were economists like Milton Friedman, then a young professor at the University of Chicago who would become the most influential economist of the 20th century. There were philosophers like Karl Popper, whose work on the open society had influenced Hayek deeply. There were journalists, businessmen, and foundation executives. What united them was a conviction that classical liberalism, the liberalism of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, of free markets and limited government, needed to be revived and updated for the modern age. They called themselves neoliberals. The term was not yet pejorative. It simply meant new liberals, thinkers who wanted to renew the liberal tradition that had been eclipsed by socialism and Keynesianism. They were explicit about their project: to change the climate of opinion, to make ideas that seemed discredited respectable again, to prepare the intellectual ground for a political transformation that might take decades to achieve. Hayek was clear-eyed about the timeline. "We must raise and train an army of fighters for freedom," he told the gathering. This was not a project for the next election cycle. It was a project for a generation. They would build think tanks and academic programs. They would cultivate journalists and politicians. They would write books and articles that would gradually shift what people considered possible and desirable. They would be patient, because they were playing a long game. The Mont Pelerin Society, as they named themselves, would meet annually for decades. Its membership would eventually include 8 Nobel laureates in economics. Its influence would spread through an interlocking network of organizations: the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, the Heritage Foundation and Cato Institute in Washington, similar bodies in dozens of countries. These organizations would fund research, train young scholars, place opinion pieces in newspapers, and advise politicians. They would create an ecosystem of ideas that would be ready when the moment came. But in 1947, the moment seemed impossibly distant. The Keynesian consensus was at its peak. Governments across the Western world were building welfare states, nationalizing industries, managing demand through fiscal policy. Unemployment was low. Growth was high. The chaos of the Depression seemed to have been tamed. Why would anyone want to return to the failed policies of the past? Hayek's answer was that the good times could not last. The Keynesian approach would eventually produce inflation. The welfare state would grow until it strangled enterprise. The regulated economy would become sclerotic and inefficient. When the crisis came, and it would come, people would be looking for alternatives. The neoliberals intended to be ready with answers. They were also developing those answers in greater detail. The early neoliberals were not simply advocating a return to 19th century laissez-faire. They recognized that pure free markets could produce monopolies, externalities, and other failures that required correction. They accepted that the state had some role to play, but a limited, rule-bound role focused on maintaining competition rather than directing economic activity. This was the neo in neoliberalism. The new liberals wanted markets, but markets structured by laws and institutions that the state would create and enforce. They wanted competition, but competition that the state would actively promote by breaking up monopolies and preventing collusion. They wanted freedom, but freedom understood primarily as economic freedom: the freedom to buy and sell, to start businesses, to keep the fruits of one's labor without excessive taxation. What they did not want was the kind of positive freedom that social democrats championed: freedom from want, freedom from fear, the freedom that came from knowing that illness or unemployment would not mean destitution. They believed that such guarantees, however appealing, came at too high a cost. They sapped individual initiative. They created dependency. They required levels of taxation and regulation that distorted markets and reduced overall prosperity. Better to have a smaller pie that was distributed by market mechanisms than a larger pie that was distributed by political decisions. The intellectual work continued through the 1950s and 1960s. Milton Friedman refined his monetary theories at Chicago, arguing that inflation was always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon that could be controlled by limiting the money supply. He also developed arguments against occupational licensing, public housing, and the minimum wage, policies that seemed obviously beneficial, but that Friedman believed did more harm than good. The Chicago School, as Friedman's circle became known, trained a generation of economists in neoliberal principles. They developed sophisticated mathematical models that gave their arguments the appearance of scientific certainty. They built careers and reputations. They waited. In Britain, the Institute of Economic Affairs published pamphlets arguing against nationalization and price controls. They seemed like cranks at first, voices from a discredited past, but they persisted, and gradually their arguments began to find audiences. Journalists discovered them. Politicians began to cite them. The intellectual climate slowly began to shift. The key insight of the neoliberal movement was that ideas matter, but they matter on a timeline measured in decades, not years. You could not simply win an election and implement your program. You had to change what people believed was possible. You had to make your ideas seem like common sense, so that when the moment came, they would be adopted almost automatically. Hayek had learned this from watching the socialists, the Fabian Society in Britain, the progressive movement in America. These had spent generations building intellectual infrastructure before their ideas became policy. The neoliberals would do the same, but in reverse. They would dismantle the consensus that the Fabians had built. The moment they had been waiting for arrived in the 1970s. The post-war boom ended. Oil shocks sent prices spiraling. Unemployment and inflation rose together. Stagflation, the economists called it, a phenomenon that Keynesian theory said should not exist. The welfare states that had seemed so successful began to strain under the weight of their commitments. Strikes paralyzed Britain. New York City nearly went bankrupt. The confident management of the economy that had characterized the post-war decades seemed to be failing. People began looking for alternatives, and the neoliberals had been preparing alternatives for 30 years. As you settle into the evening's quiet, consider the patience involved. Men who gathered in a Swiss hotel in 1947 would not see their ideas triumph until they were old or dead. Hayek would live to see Thatcher and Reagan, but just barely. Friedman would advise presidents and win a Nobel Prize. Others would remain obscure, their contribution invisible to history, but essential to the movement. September 11, 1973. Fighter jets screamed over Santiago, dropping bombs on La Moneda, the presidential palace. Inside, Salvador Allende, the democratically elected socialist president of Chile, made his final radio address. "They have force and they can subjugate us," he told his country, "but they cannot halt social processes, either by crime or by force." Then he put on a helmet, took up a rifle, and prepared to defend the palace. By afternoon, he was dead. Suicide, the military said, though doubts would persist for decades. General Augusto Pinochet took power that day. The coup had been supported by the CIA, which had spent millions trying to destabilize Allende's government. But what happened next was not simply another Latin American military dictatorship. Chile was about to become something else entirely, the world's first laboratory for the economic theory that had been gestating in academic journals and think tanks for a generation. The economists who would transform Chile had been trained at the University of Chicago. Starting in the 1950s, a program sponsored by the U.S. State Department and private foundations had brought Chilean graduate students to study under Milton Friedman and his colleagues. They returned to Chile as Chicago boys, disciples of free market economics who believed that their country's poverty could be ended through radical economic liberalization. Under Allende, they had been marginalized, their free market ideas irrelevant to a government trying to build democratic socialism. Under Pinochet, they suddenly found themselves with power beyond their wildest dreams and the military backing to implement policies that no democratic government could have imposed. The diagnosis was clear. Chile's economy was in crisis. Inflation was running above 600% annually. Price controls had created shortages of basic goods. The nationalization of industries and banks had disrupted production. The country needed shock therapy, rapid, comprehensive economic transformation that would sweep away the interventionist policies that the Chicago Boys believed had caused the crisis. What followed was the most radical experiment in neoliberal economics the world had yet seen. Almost overnight, the Pinochet regime implemented policies that would become the template for neoliberal reform worldwide. They privatized state-owned companies, hundreds of them, sold at fire sale prices to private buyers. The copper mines, Chile's most valuable resource, remained in state hands temporarily, but almost everything else was put on the auction block. Airlines, telecommunications, utilities, banks, all transferred from public to private ownership. They eliminated price controls and import tariffs. Goods that had been scarce under the controlled economy suddenly flooded Chilean markets. Inflation began to fall, not immediately, but over time, as the Chicago Boys had predicted. They deregulated labor markets, making it easier to hire and fire workers. Union power was crushed, not just economically, but physically. Union leaders were arrested, tortured, killed. The labor movement that had been the backbone of Allende's coalition was destroyed. They cut government spending dramatically. Social programs were slashed. Public employment dropped. The state that Allende had tried to expand was deliberately shrunk. And they revolutionized the pension system. Chile became the first country in the world to replace its public social security system with mandatory private retirement accounts. Workers would contribute to individual accounts managed by private firms. There would be no collective safety net, no intergenerational transfer. Each person would save for their own retirement through the market. The results were extraordinary and contradictory. GDP growth resumed after an initial collapse. Inflation fell from over 600% to single digits. Exports boomed. Foreign investment flooded in. By the 1980s, Chile was being called the Chilean miracle, a model for the developing world. But the miracle had a dark underside. Unemployment skyrocketed in the early years to over 30% by some measures. Real wages fell. Inequality, already high, increased dramatically. Privatizations transferred wealth from the state to a small class of businessmen with the right connections, often military officers and their associates, who bought state companies at fractions of their value. The social safety net that had protected Chile's poor and middle class was shredded. Public hospitals and schools deteriorated. Healthcare became a commodity. Education became a market. Those who could afford private services bought them. Those who could not made do with whatever remained of the public system. And all of this was implemented at gunpoint. When workers protested, they were arrested or shot. When students demonstrated, they disappeared. Pinochet's regime killed at least 3,000 people and tortured tens of thousands more. The Chicago Boys did their economic work while the secret police did theirs. The two were not unrelated. The economic transformation required crushing the social forces that would have resisted it. Democracy would not have permitted what dictatorship made possible. Milton Friedman visited Chile in 1975 and met with Pinochet. He later defended the visit, arguing that he was simply offering economic advice, that his recommendations were purely technical, that he could not be held responsible for the regime's political brutality. His critics were less convinced. How could you separate the economics from the violence when the violence made the economics possible? Friedman's defense rested on a distinction he had long maintained between economic freedom and political freedom. He believed these were separate spheres. A country could have a free economy without democracy. In fact, he argued, economic freedom might eventually create the conditions for political freedom. Once people experienced the benefits of markets, once a middle class emerged, they would demand political rights to match their economic freedoms.
Chile seemed to prove his point, eventually. After 17 years of dictatorship, Pinochet held a plebiscite in 1988, expecting to win continued rule. Instead, the Chilean people voted no. Democracy returned in 1990. The economic system the Chicago Boys had built remained largely intact. The subsequent democratic governments tweaked it, increased social spending, tried to make it more humane, but they did not dismantle it. By the 1990s, Chile had become Latin America's success story. Growth was steady, inflation was controlled, poverty fell significantly from its peak in the 1980s. The country was more prosperous than it had been under Allende, more stable than most of its neighbors. The neoliberal experiment, it seemed, had worked. But worked for whom? The benefits flowed disproportionately to the wealthy. Chile became one of the most unequal countries in the world. The pension system that was supposed to provide security in old age left many retirees in poverty. The private accounts had not accumulated enough, the fees had eaten into returns, the promises had not materialized. Education became stratified between elite private schools and deteriorating public ones. Healthcare followed the same pattern. The social fabric frayed. The collective bonds that had characterized Chilean society before the coup, the unions, the neighborhood organizations, the sense of common purpose, had been deliberately destroyed and never fully rebuilt. In their place emerged something else, a society of consumers and competitors, of individuals pursuing private interests in private ways, with little sense that they owed anything to each other or that the community had claims on them.
The Chilean model spread. When the International Monetary Fund and World Bank wanted to reform economies in the 1980s and 1990s, they looked to Chile. The template was clear. Privatize state companies, liberalize trade, deregulate labor markets, reduce government spending, let markets allocate resources. The Washington Consensus, as this package came to be called, was essentially the Chilean program applied globally. But there was a profound irony. The Chilean neoliberal revolution had required the destruction of democracy. It had been implemented by a military regime willing to use extreme violence to suppress opposition. When economists advised other countries to follow Chile's example, they rarely mentioned this part. They spoke only of the technical policies, not the political conditions that made them possible. Could neoliberal economics be implemented democratically? The question haunted the movement. In Chile, the answer had been no, at least not the radical version that the Chicago Boys implemented. Democratic populations would not vote for policies that produced 30% unemployment and massive wage cuts. They would not choose to dismantle their social safety nets. Democracy required some consent, some sense that the pain was shared and the benefits would eventually reach everyone. The genius of what would happen next in Britain and America was finding ways to implement neoliberal policies within democratic systems. The trick was to move incrementally rather than all at once, to create crises that seemed to demand radical solutions, to convince enough voters that there was no alternative. But Chile had served its purpose. It had demonstrated that the theories gestating in Chicago and Mont Pelerin could actually be implemented. It had shown that economies could be restructured according to market principles, that states could withdraw from economic management, that growth could resume after the initial shock. The costs were high, in unemployment, in inequality, in human rights, but to the true believers, the costs were worth it. The alternative, they insisted, was stagnation or worse. Pinochet remained in power until 1990, protected by a constitution his regime had written that made it almost impossible to change the economic system. When democracy returned, it was a constrained democracy, operating within bounds set by the dictatorship. The neoliberal order was locked in. The Chicago Boys had won. Their experiment had succeeded, at least by their own measures. Chile was growing, inflation was low, markets were free. That workers had been killed and tortured to make this possible was, in their accounting, a separate issue. That inequality had soared was the price of growth. That many Chileans felt alienated from a society that treated everything as a commodity was a problem for sociologists, not economists.
In October 2019, the bill came due. Protests erupted across Chile, triggered initially by a subway fare increase but fueled by decades of accumulated grievance. Students led the way, but they were joined by workers, by the elderly living on inadequate pensions, by people exhausted from living in a society where everything had to be purchased and nothing was guaranteed. "It's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years," the graffiti said. Not about the fare increase, but about 30 years of neoliberal democracy that had preserved the system Pinochet built. The protests forced a referendum on writing a new constitution. Chileans voted overwhelmingly yes. The constitution that enshrined the neoliberal order would finally be replaced. But the replacement process proved chaotic. The new constitution was rejected in a subsequent referendum, and Chile's future remained uncertain. The neoliberal experiment's final chapter is still being written. As you drift towards sleep, consider the price of the Chilean miracle. The economic growth was real. The poverty reduction was real. But so was the violence, the inequality, the atomization of society. Chile became wealthier and more unequal, more efficient and more alienated, more dynamic and more anxious. The Chicago boys believed they were liberating Chile from failed socialist policies. The Chileans protesting in 2019 believed they were liberating Chile from an economic system imposed by dictatorship. Both could point to evidence supporting their view. The question of whether the benefits justified the costs depends entirely on who you ask, and whether you were among those who benefited or those who paid. But Chile was only the beginning. While the Chicago boys were experimenting in Santiago, events elsewhere were creating the conditions for neoliberal ideas to spread to the heartlands of Western capitalism. The post-war consensus was about to collapse, and when it did, the alternatives the Mont Pelerin society had been developing for 30 years would be ready. In our next chapter, we travel to Britain and America, where two leaders, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, would take ideas tested in Chile and implement them in the world's most powerful democracies. The transformation would be less violent, but no less thorough. The world you know was being born. Rest now with the knowledge that ideas have consequences. The theories developed in university seminars became policies implemented by military regimes. The economists who thought they were doing technical work found their recommendations entangled with torture and murder. And the world discovered that changing economic systems was not a bloodless technical exercise, but a political struggle with winners and losers, beneficiaries and victims. Sleep well. Tomorrow, the revolution comes to the first world.
The bodies went unburied for weeks. It was the winter of 1978-79, and Britain's gravediggers were on strike. So were the trash collectors, rubbish piled up on street corners, rotting in the unseasonable warmth. The truck drivers were out too, and the hospital workers, and the railway workers, and so many others that the newspapers called it the Winter of Discontent, borrowing from Shakespeare's Richard III. This was Britain under James Callaghan's Labour government. The post-war consensus, full employment, strong unions, expansive welfare state, was collapsing under its own contradictions. The oil shocks of the 1970s had sent inflation soaring. The government tried to control it with wage freezes. The unions, who had enough power to bring the country to a standstill, refused. The result was chaos, strikes, shortages, inflation still in double digits, and a pervasive sense that Britain was ungovernable. In the Conservative Party offices, Margaret Thatcher watched and prepared. She had become party leader in 1975, an unlikely choice, a woman in a party of men, a grocer's daughter in a party of aristocrats, a radical in a party that preferred moderation. But she had something the others lacked: absolute conviction. She knew what was wrong with Britain, and she knew how to fix it. She had been reading Hayek since the 1940s. She kept a copy of The Road to Serfdom in her handbag and would pull it out at meetings, thumping it on the table. "This is what we believe," she would announce. She had cultivated relationships with the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Center for Policy Studies, the British nodes of the neoliberal network. She had studied the Chilean experiment. She was ready. In May 1979, the British people, exhausted by strikes and shortages and the sense that their country was failing, elected her prime minister. What followed would transform not only Britain, but the entire world. Thatcher's revolution began with a declaration. "Economics are the method," she told the journalist. "The object is to change the soul." This was not mere economic policy. This was a project to remake British society, to replace what she saw as a culture of dependency with a culture of enterprise, to transform citizens who expected the state to provide into individuals who took responsibility for themselves. The policies came rapidly. Interest rates were raised dramatically to squeeze inflation out of the system, the monetarist approach that Milton Friedman had advocated. The pain was immediate. Unemployment doubled within 2 years, reaching levels not seen since the Great Depression. Manufacturing collapsed. Entire industrial regions were devastated. But inflation fell, as the theory predicted it would. State-owned industries were privatized. British Telecom, British Gas, British Airways, the water companies, the electricity grid. One after another, they were sold to private investors. The sales were marketed to the public as popular capitalism. Ordinary Britons could buy shares. They would become stakeholders in the economy, property owners with a direct interest in free markets and private enterprise. The unions were broken. Thatcher chose her battles carefully, waiting until she was strong enough to win. The decisive moment came in 1984, when the National Union of Mine Workers went on strike. The miners had brought down the previous conservative government in 1974. Thatcher was determined they would not bring down hers. The strike lasted a year. The government stockpiled coal, mobilized police, and simply waited. Eventually, the miners had to return to work, defeated. Union power, which had seemed unbreakable, was shattered. Council houses, public housing where millions of working-class Britons lived, were sold to their tenants at discount prices. This was perhaps Thatcher's most politically brilliant move. It created a new class of property owners who had a stake in the system, who would vote conservative to protect their assets. It also fundamentally changed how Britons thought about housing. No longer a social right, housing became an investment, an asset whose value you wanted to see rise, even if that meant your neighbor's children could not afford homes.
The social fabric tore and rewove itself. Working-class communities that had been built around coal mines or steel mills or shipyards simply ceased to exist as the industries closed. The solidarity of the union hall gave way to the atomization of the job market, where individuals competed for positions rather than bargaining collectively for better conditions. The National Health Service remained, but around its edges, private medicine grew. Education became increasingly stratified. The BBC, which Thatcher loathed as a bastion of socialist thinking, was brought to heel. The idea that society had collective responsibilities, that communities owed each other care and support, these ideas, which had been the bedrock of post-war Britain, were actively dismantled. "There is no such thing as society," Thatcher famously said in 1987. "There are individual men and women, and there are families." The quote was taken out of context. She was making a point about personal responsibility, but it captured something essential about her philosophy. The collective had to be replaced by the individual. The welfare state bred dependency. The market bred initiative. Only by forcing people to stand on their own feet could you create the kind of dynamic, prosperous economy Britain needed. Her opponents fought back. The miners' strike was bitter and sometimes violent. Riots erupted in Brixton and Toxteth, urban areas where unemployment and poverty had created desperation. The Labour Party denounced her policies as cruel and divisive. Intellectuals warned that she was destroying everything valuable about British society. But she kept winning elections. In 1983, buoyed by victory in the Falklands War, she won in a landslide. In 1987, she won again. The British people, or at least enough of them, decided that her medicine, however bitter, was working. Inflation was down. GDP was growing. If you were in the right industries, in the right regions, with the right skills, you could prosper in Thatcher's Britain. If you were not, you were on your own. Across the Atlantic, a similar transformation was underway. Ronald Reagan took office in January 1981 with a message every bit as radical as Thatcher's. "Government is not the solution to our problem," he declared in his inaugural address. "Government is the problem." Like Thatcher, Reagan had been marinating in neoliberal ideas for decades. He had read Hayek and Friedman. He had cultivated relationships with conservative think tanks. He had simple, powerful convictions. Taxes should be low. Regulation should be minimal. Individuals should be free to succeed or fail based on their own efforts. The Reagan Revolution began with a massive tax cut. The top marginal income tax rate dropped from 70% to 28% by the end of his presidency. The theory, supplied by a new school of thought called supply-side economics, was that lower taxes would stimulate so much growth that revenues would actually increase. Cut taxes and the economy would boom. The boom would generate more tax revenue than the higher rates had. Everyone would benefit. It did not work out quite that way. The tax cuts did stimulate growth, but revenues did not increase enough to offset them. The federal budget deficit exploded. Reagan, the fiscal conservative, presided over a massive expansion of government debt. But the political brilliance of the move was that it created pressure to cut spending. With revenues down and deficits up, something had to give. The obvious target? Social programs. Spending on welfare, food stamps, housing assistance, job training, all were put. The social safety net that the New Deal and Great Society had built was torn full of holes. The justification was both fiscal and moral. The government could not afford these programs. And, more importantly, these programs were harming the people they claimed to help by creating dependency, by rewarding idleness, by destroying the work ethic that made America great.
Reagan's other major accomplishment was breaking the Air Traffic Controllers Union in 1981. When the controllers went on strike, illegally since federal employees were barred from striking, Reagan gave them 48 hours to return to work. When they refused, he fired them. All 11,000 of them, and he banned them from federal employment for life. The message was unmistakable. The President of the United States had broken a union and nothing terrible had happened. Air traffic had continued, the sky had not fallen. Other employers took note. If the government could break unions, so could they. Union membership in the private sector began a long decline that continues to this day. Like Thatcher, Reagan combined economic transformation with cultural messaging. He spoke of a morning in America, of opportunity and optimism, of a country that could achieve anything if government would just get out of the way. He lowered the top tax rate and talked about unleashing entrepreneurship. He cut social spending and talked about ending the cycle of dependency. He massively increased military spending and talked about standing strong against the Soviet Union. The contradictions did not seem to matter. Reagan was popular in ways that Thatcher never quite was. Warmer, more avuncular, better at making people feel good about policies that might hurt them. He convinced millions of working-class Americans to vote for tax cuts that primarily benefited the wealthy, for deregulation that weakened the protections they relied on, for spending cuts that shredded the safety net beneath them. How did he do it? Partly through force of personality, partly through timing. The economy did recover from the severe recession of 1981-82, and Reagan got the credit. Partly through the collapse of alternatives, the Keynesian approach seemed to have failed in the 1970s, and the Soviet Union was clearly not a model worth emulating. And partly through racial politics that redirected white working-class anger away from corporations and toward welfare recipients, most of whom, in the popular imagination, were black. Together, Thatcher and Reagan made neoliberalism respectable. It was no longer a fringe theory held by eccentric economists. It was the governing philosophy of the world's two most important English-speaking democracies. And their success, defined by falling inflation, rising GDP, electoral victories, created momentum. If it was working in Britain and America, why not everywhere? The ideas spread through mechanisms both formal and informal. The think tanks that had been seeding neoliberal ideas for decades saw their influence explode.
The Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, these organizations that had been marginal in the 1970s became central to policy debates in the 1980s. Their scholars advised governments, appeared on television, wrote op-eds that shaped public opinion. Business lobbying intensified. Corporations that had accepted the post-war settlement, strong unions, high taxes, extensive regulation, began to push back aggressively. They funded political campaigns, think tanks, academic research that supported deregulation and tax cuts. They discovered that they could win politically what they had lost at the bargaining table.
The Democratic and Labor parties moved rightward. They learned the wrong lesson from Thatcher and Reagan's victories. The lesson they took was that left-wing economics were electoral poison, that they needed to accept the neoliberal framework and offer a gentler version of it. Bill Clinton and Tony Blair would perfect this approach in the 1990s, accepting the fundamentals of neoliberalism while promising to soften its edges, to make it more inclusive, to ensure that everyone could compete in the new economy. But that accommodation came later. In the 1980s, the transformation was still raw and contested. Thatcher faced riots and strikes. Reagan faced protests from people whose benefits he cut. Both leaders were divisive in ways that American and British politics had not seen in decades. Yet both kept winning, and with each victory, the neoliberal approach became more entrenched, less questionable, more simply the way things are. The alternatives, Keynesian demand management, social democratic welfare states, anything that involved significant government intervention in the economy, were declared obsolete, relics of a failed past. By 1989, events seemed to vindicate everything Thatcher and Reagan had claimed. The Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union was collapsing, the great experiment in central planning had failed catastrophically, the Cold War was ending, and capitalism had won. Not just any capitalism, but specifically the free market, lightly regulated, low-tax capitalism that Hayek had dreamed of and Thatcher and Reagan had implemented. Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History, arguing that liberal democratic capitalism represented the final form of human government. There would be no more fundamental arguments about how to organize society. The debate was over. Markets had won. Democracy had won. The neoliberal synthesis of the two was the future, for everyone, everywhere. This triumphalism set the stage for what came next, the global spread of neoliberalism through institutions like the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, through trade agreements and structural adjustment programs, through a Washington consensus that would reshape the developing world in the 1990s. But the contradictions were already visible. Inequality was rising in Britain and America. Manufacturing workers displaced by deindustrialization had not found equivalent jobs in the service economy. The social fabric was fraying. The promise that everyone would benefit from economic growth, that a rising tide would lift all boats, was already proving hollow for millions. These contradictions would deepen over the following decades. But in 1989, with the Berlin Wall coming down and communism in retreat, it was easy to overlook them. History seemed to be moving in one direction. Resistance seemed futile. There was, as Thatcher had declared, no alternative.
As you settle into sleep tonight, consider how thoroughly the world changed in barely a decade. The post-war consensus that had seemed permanent, that governments should manage economies, that markets needed regulation, that societies had collective responsibilities to their members, was dismantled with remarkable speed. Two leaders with unshakable conviction took ideas that had been marginal for 30 years and made them mainstream. They transformed not just policies, but assumptions, not just economies, but cultures. They convinced millions that the state that helped them was actually hurting them, that the collective security they had known was actually a trap, that freedom meant market freedom above all else. Were they right? The question is almost impossible to answer because it depends on what you value and who you are. If you measure success by GDP growth and inflation rates, the Thatcher-Reagan revolution worked. If you measure it by inequality and social cohesion, it failed. If you prospered in the new economy, you likely blessed their names. If you were left behind,
you probably cursed them. What is undeniable is that they changed everything. The world before Thatcher and Reagan, the world of strong unions and high top tax rates and expansive welfare states and regulated markets, seems as distant now as the Victorian era. They made their revolution so thoroughly that we can barely remember what came before. In our next chapter, we will see how their revolution spread beyond Britain and America to reshape the entire world. The Washington Consensus would export neoliberalism to the developing world, with results both dramatic and devastating. The global economy would be restructured according to principles that Hayek sketched in a Swiss hotel and that Thatcher and Reagan proved could be implemented democratically. But that is tomorrow's story. Tonight, rest in the knowledge that ideas matter, that determined leaders can change societies, that the world is made and remade by human decisions. The world Thatcher and Reagan built is the one you inherited. Understanding how it was built is the first step toward imagining how it might be rebuilt differently. Sleep well. The revolution continues.
The hotel ballroom in Seoul smelled of desperation and expensive cologne. It was December 1997, and South Korea, the Asian tiger, the economic miracle that had transformed from post-war poverty to industrial powerhouse in a generation, was going bankrupt. The foreign currency reserves were almost gone. The won was in free fall. Banks were failing. Corporations that had seemed invincible weeks before were defaulting on billions in debt. In walked Michel Kemdesis, head of the International Monetary Fund. The photographs from that day would become infamous. The Korean president, Kim Young-sam, signing the bailout agreement while Kemdesis stood over him, arms folded, face impassive. The posture was not intentionally humiliating. Kemdesis later said he was simply tired, waiting for the ceremony to finish. But the image captured something essential about the new global order, a small group of technocrats in Washington dictating terms to sovereign nations, using financial crisis as leverage to reshape entire economies. The bailout came with conditions, 40 pages of them. South Korea would have to raise interest rates dramatically, even though that would push companies into bankruptcy. It would have to open its financial sector to foreign ownership. It would have to cut government spending in the middle of a recession. It would have to reform labor laws to make it easier to fire workers. It would have to dismantle the close relationships between government and the chaebols, the huge family-owned conglomerates that had driven Korea's development. This was the Washington Consensus in action. The term had been coined in 1989 by economist John Williamson to describe the policy prescriptions that the IMF, World Bank, and U.S. Treasury Department were pushing on developing countries. The list was familiar by now: fiscal discipline, liberalized trade, privatization, deregulation, secure property rights, competitive exchange rates. The neoliberal package that had been tested in Chile and implemented in Britain and America was being globalized. The process had been building for 2 decades. After the debt crises of the 1980s, developing countries found themselves at the mercy of the IMF and World Bank. They had borrowed heavily in the 1970s, when interest rates were low and commodity prices were high. Then, Paul Volcker, Reagan's Federal Reserve chairman, raised interest rates to crush inflation. The cost of servicing debt exploded. Commodity prices collapsed. One country after another defaulted or came close. The IMF stepped in with rescue loans, but the loans came with structural adjustment programs, SAPs they were called, and they reshaped the developing world. Countries that had been pursuing import substitution industrialization, protecting domestic industries behind tariff walls, were forced to open their markets. State-owned enterprises were privatized, social spending was cut, trade was liberalized, the economy was restructured according to market principles. The theory was that short-term pain would lead to long-term gain. Yes, laying off government workers and eliminating food subsidies would hurt. Yes, exposing domestic industries to foreign competition would cause failures. But this was necessary creative destruction. The inefficient would fail, the efficient would thrive.
Foreign investment would pour in, growth would resume. Everyone would eventually be better off. Mexico was an early test case. After its 1982 debt crisis, the government implemented sweeping reforms under pressure from the IMF and at the urging of a new generation of technocrats, many trained in American universities, who believed in the Washington Consensus. They privatized state companies, liberalized trade, reformed the financial sector, reduced inflation from over 100% to single digits. By the early 1990s, Mexico was being hailed as a success story. It joined NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, gaining access to American markets. Foreign investment flooded in. The economy grew. And then, in December 1994, it collapsed again. The peso crisis sent Mexico into a severe recession, required a massive U.S. bailout, and revealed that the miracle had been built on unstable foundations. But the Washington Consensus rolled on. Each crisis seemed to confirm the need for more reform, not less. If Mexico struggled, it was because the reforms had not gone far enough. The answer was always deeper liberalization, more privatization, greater opening to foreign capital. The human costs were staggering, but dispersed. In Africa, structural adjustment programs forced governments to cut health and education spending just as the AIDS epidemic was taking off. User fees were introduced for services that had been free. People died because they could not afford the few dollars needed to see a doctor. But the IMF cared about fiscal balance, not public health outcomes. In Russia and Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Western advisors pushed for shock therapy, the rapid transformation from communism to capitalism. The most extreme version was implemented in Russia under Boris Yeltsin. State assets were privatized almost overnight, creating a new class of oligarchs who bought national resources for pennies. Life expectancy dropped. The economy collapsed. Poverty exploded. The 1990s in Russia were catastrophic, a depression deeper than America's in the 1930s. The Western advisors who recommended shock therapy defended it as necessary. Yes, the transition was painful, but communism had failed. There was no alternative to markets. The pain would pass. Russia would emerge stronger. That millions suffered in the meantime was unfortunate but unavoidable. The same logic applied everywhere the Washington Consensus was imposed. The technocrats in Washington spoke in the language of economic science, of inevitable adjustment, of necessary reforms. The people experiencing the reforms spoke in the language of hunger and unemployment, and closed hospitals and schools that charged fees families could not afford.
The Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 98 was the moment when the contradictions became undeniable. The crisis began in Thailand and spread like contagion to Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia. These were not economies suffering from government profligacy or protectionist excess. These were the success stories, countries that had followed many elements of the neoliberal playbook while maintaining some state guidance of development. But they had liberalized their financial sectors, allowing capital to flow in and out freely. When investors grew nervous, capital fled, currencies collapsed, banks failed. The IMF's response was to demand more of what had caused the crisis: higher interest rates, more openness, less government intervention. Indonesia was devastated. The rupiah lost 80% of its value. GDP fell by 13%. Millions were thrown into poverty. The IMF's conditions included cutting fuel and food subsidies, which triggered riots. The Suharto dictatorship, which had ruled for 30 years, finally fell, a political upheaval the IMF had not anticipated and arguably did not want. Joseph Stiglitz, who was chief economist at the World Bank during the crisis, broke ranks and criticized the IMF's response. Raising interest rates during a recession made things worse, not better. Forcing countries to open their financial sectors before proper regulations were in place created instability. The one-size-fits-all approach ignored local conditions. The Washington Consensus, he argued, was based on flawed economics and had caused enormous, unnecessary suffering. The IMF defended itself. The reforms were necessary. The countries had made mistakes.
corruption, crony capitalism, bad regulation. The pain was the price of correcting those mistakes. And anyway, the alternatives were worse. Without IMF intervention, the crises would have been even more severe. Malaysia offered a test of that claim. Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad refused the IMF's help and did the opposite of what the Washington Consensus recommended. He imposed capital controls, preventing money from fleeing the country. He fixed the exchange rate. He maintained government spending. He rejected the IMF's conditions entirely. The Western press predicted disaster. The markets would punish Malaysia. Foreign investment would flee. The economy would collapse. Instead, Malaysia recovered faster than the countries that accepted IMF programs. Capital controls had worked. Government intervention had stabilized the economy. The heterodox approach had succeeded. This should have been a moment of reckoning. If Malaysia could recover by rejecting the Washington Consensus, maybe the consensus was wrong. Maybe there were alternatives. Maybe the technocrats in Washington did not have all the answers. But the moment passed. The IMF and its defenders argued that Malaysia was a special case, that capital controls created distortions, that the success would not last. The Washington Consensus continued to be imposed on crisis after crisis. Argentina in 2001, Greece after 2010. The prescription varied in details, but the core remained the same: austerity, privatization, liberalization, structural reform.
The trade architecture being built reinforced the same principles. The World Trade Organization, established in 1995, created enforceable rules that prioritized trade liberalization. Countries could no longer subsidize domestic industries or protect infant sectors from foreign competition. Intellectual property protections were strengthened, making medicine and technology more expensive for poor countries. The rules were written primarily by and for developed countries and multinational corporations, but everyone had to follow them. NAFTA connected Mexico, Canada, and the United States in a single market. The European Union expanded eastward, incorporating former communist countries into a neoliberal framework. Free trade agreements proliferated. The global economy was being knit together according to principles that the Mont Pelerin Society had articulated and that Chile had first tested. Manufacturing jobs flowed from high-wage to low-wage countries. Companies could now produce wherever labor was cheapest, wherever regulations were weakest, wherever unions had the least power. This was celebrated as efficiency. Resources were being allocated by markets rather than politics. Comparative advantage was being realized. Consumers benefited from lower prices. Workers in developed countries whose jobs disappeared to Mexico or China or Bangladesh were told to retrain, to get educated, to adapt to the new economy. If your factory closed, it was not because of bad policy, but because of inevitable market forces. The answer was more education, more skills, more flexibility. The answer was never to question whether the system itself might be flawed. The developing countries providing the cheap labor found themselves in a race to the bottom. To attract foreign investment, they had to offer low wages, weak environmental regulations, minimal labor protections. Any country that tried to impose higher standards would see investment flow to countries that did not. The competition created a powerful downward pressure on workers' rights and environmental protection worldwide. China's rise complicated the narrative. China ignored almost everything the Washington Consensus recommended. The state controlled the commanding heights of the economy. Capital flows were tightly regulated. The currency was managed, not floating freely. Industrial policy favored domestic champions. The country was authoritarian with no political freedom whatsoever. And it worked spectacularly. China lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. It became the world's factory. It grew faster and longer than any large economy in history. By the 2010s, it was challenging American economic dominance, all while rejecting the neoliberal playbook. The defenders of the Washington Consensus had to explain this. They argued that China was in transition, that it would eventually have to liberalize, that its state capitalism was unsustainable. They pointed to corruption and environmental damage and the lack of freedom. They insisted that China was the exception that proved the rule. But China's success suggested something else, that there were multiple paths to development, that state guidance of markets could work, that the neoliberal monopoly on development thinking was cracking. By the 2000s, Latin America was in open rebellion. The Washington Consensus had been imposed most thoroughly there, and the results were disappointing. Growth had been mediocre, inequality had worsened, poverty remained endemic. The promised prosperity had not materialized for most people. Left-wing governments came to power across the region. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Lula in Brazil, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, the Kirchners in Argentina. They rejected neoliberalism explicitly, increased social spending, renationalized some privatized industries, asserted more state control over resources. The results were mixed. Venezuela, under Chavez, made real progress in reducing poverty, but also became increasingly authoritarian and economically mismanaged. Brazil, under Lula, lifted millions out of poverty while maintaining fiscal discipline. Bolivia grew steadily while empowering its indigenous majority. The heterogeneity suggested that there was no single alternative to neoliberalism, just as there had been no single neoliberal model. But the shift was unmistakable. The Washington Consensus was losing legitimacy in the regions where it had been imposed most aggressively. People who had lived through privatization and austerity and structural adjustment were voting for something different. They might not have had a coherent alternative ideology, but they knew they were tired of being told that suffering was necessary for growth that never arrived. The IMF itself began to soften. Internal studies acknowledged that capital controls could be useful, that austerity during recessions made things worse, that inequality mattered for growth, that the one-size-fits-all approach had been a mistake. These admissions came quietly, buried in technical papers, never publicized the way the original prescriptions had been.
As you drift toward sleep, consider the audacity of the project. A set of economic policies developed in Western universities and tested in Chile was imposed on the entire developing world through debt crises and conditional loans. Governments that resisted were punished by markets and denied access to credit. Those that complied often saw their countries restructured in ways that benefited foreign investors and local elites while immiserating the poor. The technocrats who designed and implemented these policies believed they were helping. They believed that markets were more efficient than states, that liberalization would lead to growth, that growth would eventually benefit everyone. They had models and data and theories that supported their views. But the models left out what could not be measured: the human cost of closed hospitals, the social destruction of mass unemployment, the political consequences of telling countries they could not choose their own economic destinies. The data showed GDP growth or contraction, but could not capture the experience of a mother who could no longer afford to send her children to school or buy the medicine they needed. The Washington Consensus went global by presenting itself as scientific and inevitable. There is no alternative, they said. These are simply the policies that work. Any suffering is temporary and necessary. Trust us. We are experts. But science requires the ability to admit error, to update beliefs when evidence contradicts them, and the Washington Consensus proved remarkably resistant to evidence. When countries following its prescriptions struggled, the answer was always that the reforms had not gone far enough. When countries rejecting it succeeded, they were dismissed as special cases. In our next chapter, we will explore the world this system created, the extraordinary inequality, the financialization of everything, the precarity that defines modern work, and the crisis of 2008 that should have ended the neoliberal era, but somehow did not. We will see how the ideas from Mont Pelerin, tested in Chile, implemented in Britain and America, and globalized through Washington, shaped the world you woke up in this morning. Rest now. The story is almost told. Tomorrow, we arrive at the present and begin to ask what comes next. Sleep well. The consensus is crumbling, but the world it made remains.
The traders on the floor of Lehman Brothers had 20 minutes to pack their belongings. It was Monday morning, September 15th, 2008, and the 158-year-old investment bank had just declared bankruptcy, the largest in American history. Outside the Manhattan headquarters, television cameras captured employees leaving with cardboard boxes, their faces stunned. One carried a potted plant, another absurdly clutched a small picture frame. They walked out into an autumn morning that marked the end of an era they did not yet understand. Within days, the global financial system was on the brink of complete collapse. Banks stopped lending to each other because they did not know who was solvent and who was hiding catastrophic losses. Credit markets froze. The commercial paper market, the lubricant that allowed businesses to make payroll and buy supplies, seized up entirely. General Electric, one of the bluest of blue-chip companies, could not borrow money at any price. For 72 hours in mid-September, the global economy stood at the edge of an abyss that would have made the Great Depression look modest. The crisis had been building for years that almost no one in power had seen it coming. Or, perhaps more accurately, those who saw it coming were ignored, dismissed as pessimists who did not understand how sophisticated modern finance had become. The system, they had been assured, was resilient. Markets were self-correcting. The experts had everything under control. They did not have everything under control. The neoliberal order that had promised prosperity and efficiency had instead created a fragile, unstable system that channeled wealth upward while pushing risk downward, that privatized gains while socializing losses, that made a few people spectacularly rich while leaving millions increasingly anxious and precarious. The crisis of 2008 was not an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of policies that had been building since the 1970s. The roots reached back to the deregulation that began under Reagan and accelerated under Clinton. The financial industry, which had been tightly controlled since the Great Depression, was gradually freed from constraints. The Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial banking from investment banking, was repealed in 1999. Banks that took ordinary people's deposits could now engage in risky speculation. The distinction between prudent banking and casino capitalism dissolved. Derivatives, complex financial instruments whose value was derived from underlying assets, exploded in both number and opacity. Credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, synthetic CDOs, these were not products anyone needed. They were bets on bets, abstractions piled on abstractions, creating a shadow banking system larger than the traditional banking system and completely unregulated. When regulators suggested oversight, they were told that markets were self-regulating, that sophisticated institutions did not need government supervision, that regulation would stifle innovation and drive business overseas. Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1987 to 2006, was a devoted follower of Ayn Rand and a true believer in markets' ability to regulate themselves. He resisted all attempts to regulate derivatives, later admitting, after the crash, that he had found a flaw in his ideology. The housing bubble was built on this deregulated foundation. Mortgages were given to people who could not afford them, not because banks were charitable, but because they could immediately sell those mortgages to investors. The loans were bundled into securities, sliced into tranches, rated AAA by agencies paid by the banks creating the securities, and sold to pension funds and insurance companies and municipalities that believed they were buying safe investments.
Everyone in the chain made money. The mortgage broker got a commission, the bank that originated the loan got a fee for selling it. The investment bank that packaged the mortgages into securities got a fee. The ratings agencies got paid for their AAA stamps. The only people who bore the risk were the homeowners, who had been told that housing prices only went up, and the eventual investors who did not understand what they had bought. The ideology that permitted this was pure neoliberalism. Markets know best, Regulation is harmful. Individuals are responsible for their own choices. If someone took a mortgage they could not afford, that was their fault for not reading the contract. If investors bought securities they did not understand, that was their responsibility for not doing due diligence. The system itself was presumed to be efficient and self-correcting. When housing prices stopped rising and began to fall, the entire structure collapsed. Homeowners defaulted, the securities backed by those mortgages became worthless, the banks that had bought the securities faced massive losses. The credit default swaps that were supposed to insure against such losses proved inadequate. AIG, which had sold billions in such insurance, did not have nearly enough capital to pay claims. The response to the crisis revealed whose interests the system truly served. The government moved with lightning speed to bail out the banks. The Federal Reserve created trillions of dollars to inject into the financial system. The Treasury Department orchestrated mergers and provided guarantees. No major financial institution was allowed to fail after Lehman. The chaos that followed that bankruptcy convinced policymakers that the system could not withstand another. But homeowners received far less help. Programs to modify mortgages and keep people in their homes were poorly designed and underfunded. Millions lost their homes to foreclosure. The wealth destruction in Black and Latino communities, which had been specifically targeted with subprime mortgages, was catastrophic. Entire neighborhoods were hollowed out, properties seized and left vacant, the wealth that families had accumulated over generations wiped out. The phrase "too big to fail" entered common usage. Certain institutions were so large and so interconnected that their collapse would take down the entire system. They could therefore take enormous risks, knowing that the government would rescue them if things went wrong. They had privatized the gains. Bank executives had made tens of millions in bonuses during the bubble years and socialized the losses. Taxpayers funded the bailout.
The crisis should have discredited neoliberalism. The ideology's core claims had been proven false. Markets had not self-regulated, they had created a bubble. Financial innovation had not spread risk efficiently, it had concentrated and hidden it. Deregulation had not made the system more stable, it had made it catastrophically fragile. The invisible hand had not guided resources to their most productive uses, it had channeled them into speculation that benefited no one except the speculators. For a brief moment, it seemed like a fundamental rethinking might occur. Even Greenspan admitted he had been wrong. Books with titles like The End of Laissez-Faire and Zombie Economics appeared, pronouncing neoliberalism dead. Politicians who had championed deregulation suddenly discovered the virtues of government intervention, but the rethinking never really happened. The crisis was managed, not resolved. The banks were rescued, the economy stabilized, and once the immediate danger passed, the same people with the same ideas resumed their positions of power. The regulations that were passed, Dodd-Frank in the United States, were complex, loophole-ridden, and soon under attack from industry lobbying. The reason for this resilience was partly intellectual and partly political. Intellectually, neoliberalism had so thoroughly colonized economic thought that alternatives were barely imaginable. Economists had been trained in models that assumed markets cleared and rational expectations and efficient allocation of resources. Government intervention was by definition inefficient. Even after the crash, the basic framework remained intact. Politically, the financial industry had the resources and connections to defend itself. They funded think tanks and academic research. They hired former government officials and promised current officials lucrative private sector jobs after their public service ended. The revolving door between Wall Street and Washington spun constantly. Treasury secretaries came from Goldman Sachs and returned to Goldman Sachs. The people designing the response to the crisis were the same people whose ideology and decisions had created it. Meanwhile, the real economy suffered through the worst downturn since the Great Depression. Unemployment in the United States reached 10% officially, higher if you counted discouraged workers who had stopped looking. In Europe, it was worse. Youth unemployment in Spain and Greece exceeded 50%. An entire generation graduated into an economy that had no jobs for them.
The policy response in Europe was particularly perverse. Countries like Greece and Spain and Ireland were told they had to implement austerity, cutting government spending in the middle of a recession. The logic was that their deficits were too high, that markets demanded fiscal discipline, that there was no alternative. The human cost was immense: poverty, unemployment, closed hospitals, suicides. But the technocrats insisted it was necessary. This was neoliberalism in extremis, the demands of markets and creditors taking absolute precedence over human needs, even in a crisis that markets and creditors had caused. The European Central Bank, the IMF, and the European Commission, the Troika, imposed conditions on bailout loans that would have been politically impossible through democratic processes. Elected governments were replaced with technocratic ones in Greece and Italy. Democracy was suspended in the name of economic necessity. The irony was brutal. The same institutions that had demanded deregulation and liberalization before the crisis, creating the conditions for disaster, now demanded austerity and structural adjustment after it, deepening the suffering. The ideology that had promised prosperity had delivered crisis, and the response to the crisis was more of the ideology that had caused it.
But the crisis also made visible what had been building for decades, the staggering inequality that neoliberalism had produced. By 2008, the concentration of wealth at the top had reached levels not seen since the 1920s. The top 1% in the United States captured the vast majority of income growth over the previous 30 years. The top 0.1%, not the merely rich, but the super rich, owned more than the bottom 90% combined. This was not an accident. This was the system working as designed. Neoliberal policies systematically shifted resources and power from labor to capital. Union busting weakened workers' bargaining power. Deregulation allowed corporations to externalize costs onto workers and communities. Tax cuts for the wealthy meant less money for public services that everyone else depended on. Financialization meant that money made from money, capital gains, dividends, carried interest, was taxed less than money made from work. The result was a society stratified in ways that began to resemble the Gilded Age. The rich lived in a different world: private jets and private islands, art collections worth more than towns, bunkers in New Zealand for when civilization collapsed. The middle class, which had been the pride and foundation of post-war Western societies, hollowed out. Secure jobs with benefits gave way to contract work and gig economy employment. Pensions disappeared, replaced by 401ks subject to market whims. The working class faced stagnant wages even as productivity increased. The bargain of the post-war era, work hard, follow the rules, and you'll be able to buy a house, send your kids to college, retire with dignity, was broken. Houses became investments that only the already wealthy could afford. College became a debt trap that burdened graduates for decades. Retirement became a hope rather than a guarantee. Young people especially felt the weight of this world. They graduated with student debt that previous generations had not faced. They entered job markets that offered internships and contract work instead of careers. They could not afford the houses their parents had bought at their age. They faced a climate crisis that threatened civilization while being told that individual consumer choices were the solution. They were anxious, precarious, and increasingly angry. The opioid epidemic that swept through American working-class communities was partly a story about capitalism's human costs. People whose jobs disappeared to Mexico or China, whose towns became economically hollowed shells, whose futures held only the certainty of downward mobility, they were in pain. Pharmaceutical companies saw that pain and saw profit. They marketed opioids aggressively, lied about addiction risks, and created a public health catastrophe that killed hundreds of thousands. This was neoliberalism without pretense. A human need, pain relief, became a profit opportunity. Regulations that might have prevented overprescription were weak or absent. When addiction spread, the response was to criminalize users rather than hold companies accountable. Purdue Pharma made billions. The Sackler family became philanthropists, their name on museum wings built with blood money.
The bodies piled up in Appalachia and the Rust Belt in the regions that neoliberalism had already destroyed economically. The pattern repeated across sectors. Healthcare became ever more expensive while outcomes stagnated or worsened. Education became stratified between elite privates for the wealthy and declining publics for everyone else. Infrastructure crumbled because taxes had been cut and privatization had not delivered the promised investment. Public goods were dissolved into private markets, available to those who could pay, denied to those who could not. Even water, the most basic human need, was being privatized in some places. Nestle bottled water from drought-stricken aquifers and sold it for profit. Detroit shut off water to residents who could not pay their bills. Flint, Michigan's water became poisoned with lead because the appointed emergency manager decided to save money by switching water sources without proper treatment. Children were brain damaged because clean water was too expensive.
The gig economy embodied the neoliberal vision taken to its logical extreme. Workers were not employees, but independent contractors. They had no benefits, no security, no protections. They competed with each other through algorithms for the privilege of delivering food or driving strangers or performing whatever task the app required. The companies that owned the platforms made billions, while the workers made barely enough to survive. This was called innovation. This was called disruption. The same technologies that could have been used to reduce working hours and increase leisure instead created a panopticon of surveillance and piecework that would have impressed the most exploitative 19th century factory owner. Workers could be monitored constantly, rated by customers, deactivated by algorithms with no explanation or recourse. The companies insisted the workers loved the flexibility, and some did. The ability to work when you wanted was real, but so was the fact that you had to be available constantly, that income was unpredictable, that the flexibility was forced because no one was offering stable jobs with benefits anymore. The choice between precarity and nothing is not really a choice. The promised automation, robots taking all the jobs, mostly did not materialize. Instead, jobs were de-skilled and distributed globally. Artificial intelligence was used not to free humans from drudgery, but to monitor their bathroom breaks and track their eye movements and ensure they worked at maximum intensity every moment. Technology became a tool for control, not liberation. By the 2010s, the political consequences of all this economic transformation became undeniable. Brexit, Trump, the rise of far-right parties across Europe, left-wing movements like Occupy and Podemos in Syriza. The politics that had seemed stable in the 1990s, centrist parties alternating in power, all accepting the neoliberal framework, collapsed. People were angry. They were angry about inequality and insecurity. They were angry about being told that the system was working fine when their own lives demonstrated otherwise. They were angry about a democracy that seemed to respond only to corporate donors and not to voters. They were angry about being called irrational or racist or stupid when they objected to policies that hurt them. The anger flowed in different directions. Some blamed immigrants and racial minorities and global elites. Some blamed capitalism and corporations and the billionaire class. The diagnoses differed, but the underlying sentiment was the same. This system is not working for us, and the people in charge do not care. The neoliberal center tried to hold. They warned about populism. They defended expertise and technocracy. They insisted that the policies were sound, that people just needed to be better educated about economics. They blamed Russia or Facebook or fake news for misleading voters. They could not accept that the problem was the system they had built.
And then came the pandemic. COVID-19 in 2020 revealed every weakness the neoliberal order had created. The gutted public health systems, the just-in-time supply chains that collapsed when borders closed, the workers deemed essential but paid minimum wage, the inequality that meant some people could shelter safely in suburban homes while others risked infection to deliver their food. The response revealed possibilities that had been declared impossible under neoliberalism. Governments could create trillions of dollars.
They could impose eviction moratoriums and expand unemployment benefits. They could coordinate massive public health efforts. The state capacity that was supposed to be obsolete turned out to be essential. For a moment, it seemed like this might be the crisis that finally broke the neoliberal order. The essential workers, grocery clerks and nurses and delivery drivers, had made clear who really mattered. The billionaires who grew even richer during the pandemic had demonstrated the obscenity of the wealth concentration. Surely this would be the moment when things changed. But as you settle towards sleep, you already know how this story ends, or rather how it has not ended. The pandemic receded. The emergency measures were withdrawn. The push to return to normal, to the world of 2019, was overwhelming. The chance for transformation slipped away. The world neoliberalism made is the world you live in now, more unequal, more precarious, more anxious than the world before it. Also, more prosperous in aggregate, more technologically advanced, more globally connected. The gains and losses are real. The question is whether the trade-offs were worth it, and who got to decide. In our final chapter, we will explore what comes next. Is neoliberalism finally dying or just adapting again, as it has so many times before? What alternatives are emerging? What might a post-neoliberal world look like? And how do we live in the meantime, inside this idea that has shaped everything, waiting to see what idea might replace it? Rest now with the weight of all this history. The intellectual project that began in a Swiss hotel has reshaped the entire world. The policies tested in Chile spread across continents. The promises of prosperity and freedom delivered wealth for some and insecurity for many. The system that declared there is no alternative may finally be facing alternatives it cannot ignore. Tomorrow we ask what comes after the end of history. Tonight, rest in the ruins of the world neoliberalism made, knowing that all systems end, that all orthodoxies eventually become heterodoxy, that the ideas that seemed permanent in 1995 seem fragile now. Sleep well. The story is not over. What comes next is still being written.
The graffiti appeared on a wall in Turin, Italy during the lockdowns of 2020. Someone had painted in large letters, "We were not made for this world. This world was made for us, and we can remake it." The message was unsigned, the artist unknown, but the sentiment captured something that was spreading across the globe, a growing recognition that the world as it had been arranged was neither natural nor inevitable, that the rules could be changed because the rules had been made. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist who died in one of Mussolini's prisons, once wrote about the interregnum, the space between a dying order and whatever comes next. The crisis consists, he observed, precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. We are living in that interregnum now. Neoliberalism is not dead, its institutions persist, its assumptions still structure policy, its beneficiaries still hold power. But it is dying, slowly, losing legitimacy and coherence, unable to solve the problems it has created or even to name them accurately. And the new, whatever it will be, cannot yet be born. So we live with the morbid symptoms, political chaos, conspiracy theories, the rise of authoritarianism, the sense that the center cannot hold. Tonight, as we close this journey through the idea that remade the world, we ask what comes next. What alternatives are emerging from the ruins of the neoliberal consensus? What might a post-neoliberal world look like? And how do we live in the meantime inside a system that no longer works, but that we cannot yet escape? The challenges to neoliberalism are coming from multiple directions, left and right, global north and south. They share little except a conviction that the status quo is unsustainable. From the nationalist right comes a rejection of globalization's free movement of goods and people, Trump's tariffs and border walls, Brexit's reclamation of sovereignty, Orban's Hungary building fences, Modi's India asserting Hindu nationalism.
These movements blame immigrants and foreign competition and global elites for the insecurity that neoliberalism created. Their solution is to restore the nation-state as the primary locus of identity and economic management. This is not a return to the post-war consensus. The nationalist right does not want strong unions or expansive welfare states. They want protected markets and cultural homogeneity, borders that capital can cross but people cannot, hierarchies of citizenship that determine who deserves care and who can be excluded. It is neoliberalism with walls, maintaining the market fundamentalism while rejecting the cosmopolitan pretensions.
The danger in this approach is visible everywhere it has been tried. The walls do not bring back the factory jobs. The tariffs do not rebuild manufacturing sectors destroyed by decades of offshoring. The scapegoating of immigrants does not address the structural forces creating insecurity, and the authoritarianism required to enforce these borders metastasizes, undermining the democratic freedoms that were supposed to be preserved.
From the left comes a different set of challenges, often grouped under the banner of democratic socialism or the Green New Deal. Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the United States, Jeremy Corbyn's Labor in Britain, Podemos in Spain. These movements want to rebuild the state capacity that neoliberalism dismantled: public health care, free education, green public investment, strong unions, wealth taxes, regulations that restrain corporate power. The Green New Deal crystallizes this vision. It recognizes that climate change cannot be addressed through market mechanisms alone, that the scale of transformation required demands public investment and planning, that the transition must be just, protecting workers whose livelihoods depend on fossil fuels, ensuring that the costs do not fall on the already vulnerable. This is explicitly a rejection of neoliberal logic. Markets did not create the climate crisis, but they did nothing to prevent it, because the incentives were all wrong. Corporations externalized the costs of carbon emissions onto society and future generations. By the time the damages became undeniable, the problem was too large for incremental market-based solutions. The obstacles to this approach are formidable. The fossil fuel industry has tremendous political power. The beneficiaries of the current system will not surrender their advantages without a fight. The international coordination required is difficult when nations compete for investment and jobs. And the democratic socialism movements have not yet found a way to win power and hold it long enough to implement their programs. Corbyn lost. Sanders did not win the nomination. Podemos governed in coalition but could not implement its full agenda. The movements have popular support, especially among the young, but translating that support into durable political power has proven elusive. The institutional advantages, media ownership, campaign finance, the ideological capture of economics departments still favor the neoliberal status quo. Modern monetary theory has emerged as an intellectual challenge to fiscal orthodoxy. MMT economists argue that governments that control their own currency cannot run out of money, that deficits are not inherently problematic, that the real constraint is inflation, not debt. This sounds radical because neoliberalism trained us to think of government budgets like household budgets. You cannot spend more than you earn. But governments are not households. They can create money. The question is what real resources are available, not whether the numbers balance. The implications are profound. If MMT is correct, then austerity was always unnecessary. Governments could have maintained spending during recessions, investing in infrastructure and green energy and public services. The suffering imposed in the name of fiscal responsibility was pointless cruelty, sacrificing real human welfare to satisfy an accounting fiction.
The pandemic seemed to prove MMT right. Governments created trillions of dollars to support economies through lockdowns. Inflation did not immediately spike. The disaster that deficit hawks predicted did not materialize. The money was there when political will existed to spend it. But MMT also has limits. Inflation is a real constraint, as became clear in 2021-2022 when supply chain disruptions and pent-up demand did drive prices up.
The theory is correct that governments can create money, but wrong if it suggests there are no trade-offs, that unlimited spending is possible. The real resources, labor, materials, productive capacity, remain finite. Creating money does not create those resources. Still, MMT has shifted the conversation. The question is no longer how will you pay for it, but do we have the real resources to do this? It is a more honest framing, one that makes clear that political choices about resource allocation are exactly that, choices, not inevitabilities dictated by budget constraints. Degrowth presents perhaps the most radical challenge. Its proponents argue that infinite growth on a finite planet is impossible, that the pursuit of GDP growth is itself the problem, that we need to deliberately shrink the economy to sustainable levels while redistributing what remains more fairly. This is heresy to both neoliberals and traditional leftists, both of whom assume that growth is necessary for prosperity. Neoliberals want growth through markets. Leftists want growth plus redistribution. Degrowth says the growth itself must stop, that we already produce more than enough for everyone to live well, that the problem is distribution, not production, that a smaller economy focused on sufficiency rather than accumulation would be both more sustainable and more humane. The vision is compelling. Work less, consume less, pollute less, stress less. Measure success by well-being rather than GDP. Value leisure and community and ecological health over material accumulation. Reject the treadmill of consumer capitalism for a simpler, slower, more connected way of life. The obstacles are equally clear. How do you implement degrowth when every country competes for growth? How do you convince workers to accept lower material living standards, even temporarily? How do you manage the transition without creating unemployment and poverty? Degrowth works as a critique, but struggles as a program. Still, the ecological crisis may force the issue. If we cannot find a way to degrow voluntarily and justly, climate change and resource depletion will impose involuntary and unjust degrowth. The choice may be between planned contraction and chaotic collapse.
The Global South is charting its own alternatives. China's state capitalism has already been mentioned, but there are other experiments. Careless focus on human development over GDP growth, achieving health and education outcomes comparable to wealthy nations at a fraction of the income. Bolivia's recognition of indigenous rights and the rights of nature. The solidarity economy movements in Latin America building cooperative enterprises outside the market-state binary. These alternatives are diverse and often contradictory. They share a rejection of the Washington Consensus's one-size-fits-all approach. They assert that development can take multiple forms, that Western industrial capitalism is not the only path, that traditional knowledge and local contexts matter. The challenge is that these alternatives exist within a global system still structured by neoliberal rules. Trade agreements constrain what governments can do. Capital flight punishes policies that investors dislike. The International Monetary Fund still imposes conditions on loans. Breaking free completely would require coordination among countries that often compete with each other for investment in markets. But the conversation has shifted. The assumption that all countries must follow the same development path has been discredited. The possibility of multiple modernities, of different ways to organize society and economy is being asserted and sometimes realized. Technology presents both possibilities and dangers. Artificial intelligence and automation could reduce necessary working hours, allowing humans to spend more time on creativity and care and community. Or they could eliminate jobs while concentrating wealth even further in the hands of whoever owns the algorithms. The difference depends on political choices. Will the gains from automation be shared broadly or captured by capital? Will reduced labor requirements mean 4-day work weeks and universal basic income? Or will it mean mass unemployment and immiseration? The techno-optimists believe that markets will distribute the benefits, that new jobs will emerge to replace those automated, that technology always increases prosperity. The techno-pessimists see a future of permanent unemployment and algorithmic surveillance, of gig work and declining wages, of a tiny elite served by machines while everyone else struggles.
History suggests both are partly right. Technology does increase productive capacity. It does destroy jobs and create new ones. But the distribution of gains depends on power, on who owns the technology, on whether workers can bargain collectively, on whether the state intervenes to ensure broadly shared prosperity or allows winner-take-all dynamics to dominate. Neoliberalism assumed that market forces would ensure technology benefited everyone. The evidence suggests otherwise. Without conscious political intervention, without deliberate choices about how to distribute technological gains, we will get more inequality, not less.
The question then becomes, what political formations can successfully challenge neoliberalism and implement alternatives? The traditional political parties seem inadequate. The center-left parties that accommodated neoliberalism in the 1990s, Clinton's Democrats, Blair's Labor, have lost the trust of their working-class base without winning the loyalty of the educated professionals they courted. The center-right parties face insurgent nationalist movements that reject their globalism while maintaining their market fundamentalism. New movements have emerged. Occupy, Black Lives Matter, climate strikes, the movement for Black Lives, but they have struggled to translate protest energy into durable political power. They are good at mobilization and disruption, less successful at the long, grinding work of governance and institution building that transforms systems rather than merely opposing them. The left populist experiments, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, Sanders and Corbyn in the Anglosphere, mobilized millions but largely failed to gain or hold power. They faced sabotage from within their own parties, hostile media, capital flight, and institutional resistance. The lesson may be that you cannot win on the left by promising to fundamentally reshape the economy. Too many powerful interests will align to stop you. Yet the centrist alternative, managing neoliberalism more humanely, softening its edges without changing its fundamentals, keeps failing too. Macron in France, the German Grand Coalitions, Biden in the United States, they can win elections, but they cannot solve the underlying problems. Inequality continues to rise, climate change accelerates, precarity deepens, the morbid symptoms multiply.
Perhaps the issue is that we are still thinking within categories that neoliberalism created. Left versus right, state versus market, growth versus stagnation, freedom versus equality. These binaries obscure more than they reveal. What if the relevant question is not markets or states, but what kind of markets and what kind of states? Markets structured by what rules, operating within what boundaries, serving what purposes? States accountable to whom, structured how, with what powers and limits? What if the choice is not between growth and degrowth, but about what we want to grow and what we want to shrink? Grow renewable energy and care work and public transit, shrink fossil fuels and arms manufacturing and financial speculation, measure different things, value different outcomes. What if freedom and equality are not trade-offs but prerequisites for each other? True freedom requires material security. You are not free if you must accept any job or lose your health care. True equality requires democratic participation. You are not equal if money buys political power. Reframing the questions this way opens different possibilities, not a single alternative to neoliberalism, but many alternatives, adapted to different contexts, experimenting and learning, failing and adapting, a pluralism of approaches rather than a new universal consensus.
The transition will not be smooth. The beneficiaries of the current system will resist. The institutions built over 40 years cannot be dismantled overnight. The intellectual frameworks that structure how we think about economy and society will not dissolve simply because we wish them to. We are living in the interregnum. The old order is dying, slowly, fitfully, fighting for every breath. The new order cannot yet be born. It is not clear what it will look like, who will build it, or how they will overcome the obstacles in their path.
In the meantime, we have the morbid symptoms, the conspiracies and authoritarianisms, the performative radicalism that changes nothing, the technocratic managerialism that cannot imagine beyond incremental adjustment, the apocalyptic visions that paralyze rather than mobilize. But we also have experiments and alternatives. Worker cooperatives proving that democratic ownership is possible, mutual aid networks demonstrating that care can be organized outside markets, communities building resilience and solidarity, thinkers developing frameworks that make different futures imaginable. The question is not whether neoliberalism will end. All ideologies do eventually. The question is what replaces it, whether the transition is managed democratically or imposed autocratically, whether the new system distributes power and resources more justly or simply creates new hierarchies. As you drift towards sleep on this final night of our journey, consider what role you play in this unfolding story. You are not a passive observer. The system we have been exploring, the neoliberal order built over decades, imposed globally, now cracking under its contradictions, exists only because millions of people participate in it daily. Every time you accept precarity as normal, you reinforce it. Every time you imagine that there is no alternative, you make alternatives less possible. Every time you treat human needs as market opportunities, you extend the logic that created the problem. But the inverse is also true. Every time you organize collectively, you build power that markets cannot commodify. Every time you assert that housing or healthcare or education are rights, not privileges, you challenge the foundations of neoliberal ideology. Every time you imagine and work toward different arrangements, you make them more real. The intellectuals who gathered at Mont Pelerin in 1947 understood that ideas matter, that changing the world requires first changing what people believe is possible. They were patient, they built institutions, they waited for their moment, and when it came, they were ready. Those who want to build something after neoliberalism must learn the same lesson. This is not the work of a single election or protest. This is generational work. Building new institutions, developing new ideas, creating new common sense. The morbid symptoms will persist until the new can be born. The birth will not be easy.
You live inside an idea. Neoliberalism structures your world so thoroughly that you probably cannot see all the ways it shapes you. The career anxiety, the optimization of every moment, the sense that you are on your own and must compete with everyone. The idea that your value is measured by your productivity, the feeling that there is never enough time, never enough money, never enough security. These are not natural features of human existence. They are products of a specific system, built by specific people for specific purposes. They can be changed. The world was made for us, not in our interests necessarily, but by human decisions and human actions, which means we can remake it. Not easily, not quickly, not without conflict and setbacks and failures, but we can remake it. The neoliberal project began with a small group of intellectuals who believed civilization was heading in the wrong direction. They were right about some things and wrong about others. They built a movement that would reshape the world. That movement is now exhausted, unable to address the crises it has created. The next movement, whatever it is being born in this moment, in the climate strikes and mutual aid networks, in the worker organizing and debt strikes, in the new economic thinking and the old cooperative traditions being revived, in the millions who know that this world is not working and are searching for alternatives. You are part of that next movement, whether you know it or not. The choices you make about how you work and consume and relate to others, about whether you accept or resist the logic of markets, about whether you believe there are alternatives, these choices matter. Not because any individual choice will change the system, but because systems are made of millions of individual and collective choices, and when enough people start choosing differently, the system changes. Slowly, unevenly, with resistance and backlash, but it changes. The story of neoliberalism is the story of how ideas become reality. A philosophy developed in universities became policy implemented globally. Theories about markets became lived experience for billions. The world was remade according to a vision. The story after neoliberalism will be the same. Ideas will matter. Organizing will matter. Patience and persistence will matter. The work of imagining different futures and building institutions to realize them will matter. There is no guarantee of success. The next order might be better or worse than what we have now. History does not move in straight lines toward justice. Progress is not inevitable, but neither is the current system. Nothing is inevitable except that all systems change. So sleep now, knowing that you live in history, not at its end. The world neoliberalism made is crumbling. What comes next is not yet determined. The interregnum stretches before us, full of dangers and possibilities. Tomorrow, when you wake, you will still be living inside the idea, but you will know it is an idea, not a law of nature. And knowing that, really knowing it, feeling it, is the first step toward changing it. Rest well. The old world is dying. The new world is struggling to be born. Now is the time of monsters and marvels both. Now is the time when everything seems impossible and nothing is certain. Now is the time when the future is being written. Sleep and dream of worlds beyond this one. Some of those dreams might just become real.